Welcome to the channel. Thank you everyone for tuning in. So in today's video, this is part 2, we are going to be continuing with that comparison of the three Pelagos homages or Pelagos. Apparently that's the way you say it. So we have the Seestern, we have the Octopus Kraken, and we also have the IX&DAO. Now, last episode I covered the specifications, the prices, and also the measurements, and that took us to around 8 to 10 minutes. And I'm going to keep this relatively short because there's a lot of information to carry over. Initially we thought, they were very similar, there's not much differences, there's even like theories that state they're all from the same factory, or that's the working hypothesis. So throughout this comparison we want to see how different they really are, and then feasibly are they from the same place. If not, and there's loads of elements, I've really gone to town on this comparison. So quick summary. In terms of dimensions, I'm not going to bore you with all the smaller details. Please check out that first episode of that mini series that we did, because there's everything covered on there. But to summarize, the Seestern and the IX&DAO were the closest on dimensions. The only thing that separated them was the thickness on the Seestern, because that is an NH38 as opposed to the PT5000 on both the Octopus and the IX&DAO. The Octopus Kraken is actually the smallest out of these three. That includes, overall log to log and also diameter. And the IX&DAO, in terms of specifications, it only has a 60 click unidirectional bezel, whereas the other two have 120 click. And it has actually no ghost position, even though it used the PT5000. So there's a bit of pros and cons with all of them, right? I think a lot of people kind of lean towards the Octopus Kraken initially, but in this second episode we are actually going to look at the dial. We're actually going to also cover the bezel and the crystal. We're going to cover these three, and I think that'll take me to the end of today's episode, and then the next time we'll pick it up on the case and bracelet. I think I can do those two together, but there's immense detail here, there's immense differences here. It will actually shock you how different things are. Now, I'm kind of leaning towards already that I don't think they're from the same place, unless these are, I don't know, batch variations or the same guys making them but just slightly differently, but it is ridiculously different. Okay, so let's make a start. So the first thing, and one of the reasons why I picked these particular ones, is because when you are homaging the Pelagos, we want to make sure the looks are more or less exactly the same. This is why I didn't include the San Martin, because it looks very different to these three, and it'll be like kind of off comparison. So with regards to the Seestern, let's first take a look at the dial finishing. Now, they all pretty much have exactly the same style of sunburst when you look at these black dials. It's a very difficult thing to do on black. You normally get enamel black or high gloss black or matte. To get this, very subtle sunray, which is one of the most striking features that I find on the actual Pelagos, and which is why I like it. It is very difficult. So, credit due for execution to whichever factories produce these dials, because if we take a look on the Seestern, which we have, it's spot on. Now, the Octopus does not differ in any way, shape or form, and a lot of these comparisons are to the naked eye, only what I can see. And with a lot of the macros, these are the things which you'll probably notice something a bit more different, but those again are visibly noticeable to me, which I've pointed out. And then the IX&DAO, again, very similar on the sunray. So far exactly the same. So now let's take a closer look at the dial, and let's look at the smaller details. All three watches have printed text throughout the dial. They have the logos printed just below the 12, and all three dials contain 2 lines of text. You've got scripted text under the Seestern, you've got Octopus Kraken logo, again 2 lines, as well as the IX&DAO with additional that flower that they went for on the IX&DAO, which is just below the 12. Now, the Seestern and the IX&DAO have actually 3 lines of text at the 6. This is where the Octopus kind of sets itself apart from the other two, because it only has 2 lines of text. Now, whereas the Seestern, Octopus use the similar style of white text on the printing, the IX&DAO is different here because it uses the off-white, slightly cream color text, which is present on the logo at 12, and also that white text, or which is meant to be white above the 6, but you can see it's in the off-white, leaning way more towards the cream. Now, there's also a difference in the red text used on the IX&DAO. It's a lot darker than the other 2 watches, which use a brighter red to notify the water resistance rating, but back to IX&DAO, it uses a much darker red. Now, they all use non-standard font. It's nice font, it is stylized, it's not your basic Arial font, which I totally dislike. And the one thing that IX&DAO does differently is it has that curvature on the text, so it's curved, that self-winding text. Now, we're not going to debate the type of logos that they've used, or the text they've put on there, like IX&DAO has put IX&DAO Timeless and then Milli Diver, Self-Winding. Is that necessary? That's not what we're discussing here today. We're just looking at the differences on all three watches. Now, the next step is to look at the markers. Now, between all the markers, this is what I can tell you, from the naked eye, you might not see this on camera or in the pictures, is that all the shades of lume, when you look at these hour markers, BGW9 lume does have a slightly off-white lume. They are all different, however, they do have very good consistency amongst their own markers and dials and hands. The IX&DAO is probably the brightest or the whitest style of lume, followed by the Seestern and then the Octopus Kraken. Next up, when we look at the actual hour markers or the indexes, we'll see there's also a difference in sharpness. The Seestern has the pointiest markers on the dial. You can see that on the triangle and also the square and the batons, followed by the Octopus. The Octopus is slightly softer, but then you've got the IX&DAO, which is a bit more rounded. There are no corners visible on there. They are, very well rounded indeed. So they vary in sharpness, starting at Seestern being the sharpest points, then Octopus, then IX&DAO. Now we can move on to the handset. And with the handset, we see small differences. So between the Seestern and the IX&DAO, they both have the larger snowflake hour hand. I think they are similar in size. I did take an awful long time looking at these two handsets. Now, without opening these watches apart and actually physically measuring the hands, which I didn't want to do, they both look visually similar. The Octopus Kraken visually has a smaller snowflake hour hand. Now, there's a slight difference on the minute hand. In terms of width, there's not much to it. You also see a slight difference due to the lume coloration. However, the length, this is where we can see something different. All the hand lengths are great. They've all got great proportions. However, when we look at a closer level, the Seestern is the shortest. Then the Octopus is just a touch bigger because it's a bit closer to that chapter ring, and the IX&DAO being the longest, where it's almost touching that marker. Now, with regards to the seconds hand, again, we also have a difference there on the snowflake. So the Seesterns is the largest, I'd say, followed by the Octopus Kraken, but they're both in the same position where they are on the seconds hand. The IX&DAO is the smallest, but it is a bit further back on that seconds hand. So that is the difference there on the seconds hand. The quality of all the hands is very well done. You can see on the closer macros that they're very sharp, crisply printed. I mean, there's no defects there to the naked eye. You can't see any sort of defective printing. And when we have looked at these macros, I want you to note this, that all three watches are incredibly well built, especially these dials that we're looking at. Now let's look at alignment. Now when it comes to alignment, it's very tricky. It's on, the micro millimeter. It's so close to call it. However, I have to say the Seestern shows the straightest alignment. And bearing that in mind, none of them are really actually misaligned. There's just a very tight variation, which is totally allowable. It's within some tolerances. There's nothing that exists without any sort of tolerance or variation. Followed by, I'd say, possibly the IX&DAO, but Octopus and IX&DAO are basically the same. What happens is when you have the 12 o'clock marker and the 6 o'clock marker, they do rarely align, on a perfect straight line. Usually you get a variance where if the 12 o'clock marker is dead straight, you'll find the 6 o'clock is just slightly out. And again, this is very close to call, but as I said, overall the Seestern shows the best alignment. That is to my eyes and the way I took those pictures. Now let's move on to the part where you want to see is the lume. And I gotta tell you guys, I recorded this over a minute. I gave them all a good 10-second blast with a UV lamp. Just to make sure that it was all equal, and there's no difference within the lume. Everything is exactly the same, even visually. Nothing seemed brighter than the others, not one faded quicker than the other. All great amounts of lume, and all of them have got the exact same amount of lume on the bezel insert. Also, they've got that 15-minute track or lume as well. So there we are, pretty evenly matched on the lume. Now let's take a look at the bezel now, where you've got the bezel markers. In the next video, we're going to look at bezel rotation and the bezel construction. But just visually, the IX&DAO has the thinnest markers on the bezel insert. They are visibly thinner than the other two. I think there's a slight difference between the Octopus and the Seestern, but again, my eyes, there's some elements which I end up getting blind to, and I had to have a little reset and look at it again. And now with regards to the lume match between the bezel and the dial, the Octopus Kraken had probably the poorest lume match because the bezel markers are quite whiter, whereas the markers are a bit yellower or a bit creamier. And the last thing, they all had a difference on the pip. So you've got the Octopus Kraken having the biggest, pip in that triangle, followed by the Seestern, and then the IX&DAO. But these are minute differences, as I said, coming down to, you know, the micromillimeters. So yeah, this is what we have on the dial. I've listed off quite a lot of differences, no doubt. It's a lot to soak in. Okay, so the last thing we want to look at is the sapphire crystal. This is one thing I noticed as I was, you know, catching glare off the dials. So the Seestern, you can see that blue AR coating, and that is also present on the Octopus Kraken. You can see that hint of blue. Neither are, you know, over the top or getting in the way of anything like we used to see, you know, a couple of years ago. And the IX&DAO, you can see it's got clear AR coating. There's no hint of blue there. So that is the difference on the sapphire crystals. Okay, to summarize, how do we summarize on that, guys? I feel like I've run a marathon, the amount of, you know, the issues I've pointed out, the little differences that we can see. What I'd say for myself, this is where we need to be subjective, so everyone is going to differ. So let me know in the comments section below, what do you prefer about which, you know, kind of watch? What do you like from each sort of watch that we've looked at, the smaller features on the dials, etc. For me, I do like the softer, the more rounded hour markers on the IX&DAO. It gives them more of a 3D pronounced effect, that they are actually stuck down. It makes them look a bit thicker as well, whereas I think the Octopus and the Seestern just look a bit more stuck on or drawn on. But having said that, I don't like the off-white coloration that you find on the IX&DAO, and I prefer the much whiter text on the Octopus or the Seestern. It really does go with the overall color. And I also prefer, I think the Seestern and IX&DAO had, they've kind of color matched the Lume to the hands and to that bezel, you know, which I think the Octopus is just slightly off. And these are, you know what, just things that you would never pick up or moan about, but with this comparison, this is the level you have to go to. So that's it for this video today, guys. I mean, I'm conscious of the time. I want to make this, you know, quite compact and put everything in one section. So the next video that we're going to do is going to be the differences on the case and then the bracelet. And if you think they're going to be similar or it's going to be less work or less differences, you've got another thing coming. I found so many small differences on the case and the bracelet, and I do have my work cut out for me, as I said before. So that's it for me today, guys. As always, you know, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and as always, again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.